Okay, now we're going to move into part two. And we have now the research of Gunnar Johansson. And Gunnar Johansson has done a couple of things here. Number one, he is describing the ability to perceive objects in motion, sort of like with the kinetic depth effect structure for motion displays that we looked at before. And one of the questions that we might have is when we see those dots moving, in fact, it might in fact even be useful for me to run back to one of these like this one. And we're going to ask the question, on what basis do we know or perceive that any of the dots that we're seeing here all belong to the same object, right? That is a whole bunch of different dots and they're all moving and they're not touching or connecting. Sometimes they touch each other, I guess, but for the most part, they're just isolated dots on the screen. And if you recall from some of the stuff in the book about the Gestalt laws, the idea is that in certain displays depicted typically in Gestalt research, is some of these isolated dots and lines tend to get perceptually grouped together so that they belong together as a coherent whole. And Johansson was the one, let me pause this now and try to get back to where we were. There we are. Oops, don't want to start that yet. Johansson is the one who gave us the Gestalt organizational rule known as common fate. And what that refers to is the idea that when you have these multiple dots moving in the same direction, and sort of in a form of synchrony, right? It's not just the fact that they're moving in the same direction, but they're moving in a way where their movement becomes synchronized somehow. And by synchronized, I mean that they're moving in the same direction at the same speed. And if one stops, the other one stops. And if one reverses direction, the other one reverses direction at the same time. And so that kind of synchrony of changes of direction, speed, and stopping, that kind of stuff causes us to perceptually link these things together and create that coherent whole. And that's Johansson's explanation for why that rotating sphere appears to be a coherent whole. He's not yet, this was so far back in the 1950s that we didn't yet have some of the details of motion parallax and motion perspective and optic flow and all that stuff even worked out yet. So he's simply just appealing to the idea of common fate. But he goes a little further than this, though. He also talks about something that he refers to as perceptual vector analysis. So what in the world is that? Well, it might again kind of help to revisit some maybe high school math, or is it college algebra? I don't remember. The idea of having a vector on a Cartesian coordinate plane, right? And a vector is a quantity that points in a specific direction and has a certain length. And in fact, the optic flow vectors we talked about before qualify mathematically as these kinds of mathematical entities. And so in the case of a motion vector, that is simply, again, sort of like an arrow that we could draw that describes both the direction of motion of any one of those dots on that rotating sphere, but also the length of the arrow would describe sort of the magnitude of the motion, right? Longer arrows meaning like higher velocity, but for the most part, we maybe just want to think about their direction. And it is possible in vector algebra to add vectors together and subtract vectors from each other. And that's what we're talking about here. And according to Johansson, something that the perceptual system just kind of automatically does, because he was a Gestaltist, I guess you could say that he believed it was kind of innate that the visual system just does things this way, that the visual system engages in a form of perceptual vector analysis. But instead of trying to dive into the mathematics of this, I think it's a whole lot easier to understand it by watching these displays. And so another thing that Johansson did, the second big thing besides giving us perceptual vector analysis, is he invented a research technique known as the point light display. And the point light display has gone on to become a mainstay in event perception research. And the idea of a point light display is that we're simply just going to attach a small electric light to something, and we're going to turn off the lights and film that something moving around in the dark. And we're just going to be able to see it only by the motion of that one little light bulb attached to something, right? And so we get these isolated points of dots of light, or points of light, hence why it's called a point light display, moving around. And we want to understand and think about what kinds of things could a person perceive from that one's, moving or multiple moving points of light. And this is where we can maybe help to think about what perceptual vector analysis is. So there is a voiceover. I've got this muted because we don't really need that. We don't need this guy talking. There's Gunnar Johansson. So here's something I'm going to try to pause it right here. What you're seeing here, let's go back. This shows the oscilloscope that he's using to create this first display. Is you're seeing, well, when I hit pause, it's just a random arrangement of dots, right? This is not exactly the same kind of point light as I described before with a light bulb attached to something, because this is a kind of an animation. But we notice that everything is random. And when I say random, that means that all these dots are all moving and they're all doing their own thing, right? Each dot motion is independent of every other dot's motion. And when we see that, there is nothing that we group together. It just becomes like 100 different fireflies flying around on here, right? Everything is independent. But notice what happens. We start adding in coherence, right? Suddenly there is a segment of all of these dots that begins to move in synchrony with each other. So let me roll that back and pay close attention here, right? It's a bunch of random dot motions. Everything is independent, but suddenly things start to sync up with each other, and we start to see this perceptual whole, this configuration of dots moving together as a coherent whole. And that's where we invoke that common fate idea. But how do we go further into perceptual vector analysis? So now let's look at this single point of light. And if you see it, and let's roll it back, it goes by so quickly here. Let me give you the explanation first. Watch the path of this moving dot, and you're going to notice that it is tracing a diagonal pattern that is something of a flat ellipse or oval, right? And that's what it's doing, is you are seeing it trace that kind of elongated, diagonally oriented oval or ellipse. But now what we're going to do is we're going to add a second dot above it, and that second dot's just moving left and right across the screen. But as soon as we add that second dot, we don't really see that, and now we're at a third dot. We don't really see that ellipse pattern anymore. It seems to disappear. It's still there in a way, right? That one dot, the first dot, is still moving in the exact same elliptical pattern, but it's harder for us to notice it because of those other dots that are now. And now as we start taking them away one by one, it becomes now possible for us to perceptually recover the original trajectory, right? We'll pause it here for a second. So what does that mean, right? When that one first dot was presented by itself, it's moving in that elliptical pattern. When we add those other first just one and then a second and then a third dot above and below it, we haven't changed anything about the pathway of the initial dot. It still is tracing the exact same diagonal elliptical trajectory. But suddenly at a perceptual level, we simply don't even really notice that or have even possibly some difficulty perceiving that trajectory. Instead, we tend to see a separate configuration where the three other dots are moving left and right across the screen. And let's run that back again now. These other dots are moving left and right across the screen. And that first dot is just moving up and down between them, right? So now we just have some sort of like a yo-yo thing going up and down while the entire configuration is just going left and right across the screen. This is where we talk about relative and common motion, right? Because initially what we saw is what we would call the absolute motion vector of that first dot, which is again, that diagonal motion. But as soon as we have other dots that are present, and it is possible to find some sort of synchronous pattern between all these dots, then suddenly we decompose that initial motion vector into its relative component, which is how does that dot move relative to the other dots, which is up and down part. And then what is the common motion vector? What does it share in relation to the other dots? And that is the left and right motion, right? So we have now taken the original motion vector, which was the diagonal trajectory, and we have decomposed it into a left and right component and an up and down component. And those two components, when added together, would give us the actual object's motion. But again, the idea, according to Johansson, is that that's not what the visual system is seeing. The visual system sees only the relative and the common motion, not the absolute motion trajectory. And now we're going to, let me run that one back again, because we're going to see a different demonstration. And this is going to be a rolling wheel example. As we get back to this, right? What you're going to see is they're going to have this a wheel-shaped object, and they're going to put a light on just the edge, the outer edge or the rim of the wheel. There it is. Now we have the lights on at this point. This is just to show you what they're doing. Now we're going to turn the lights off though. And what we see is what is this, right? That light on the rim of the wheel does not turn in a circle the way you would expect it to, right? Instead, it traces a weird bouncing ball kind of pattern that's referred to as a cycloid. And so it's tracing a cycloid pattern across the screen. Now, that cycloid pattern is something of a surprise, right? It's not like we don't normally think of an object that's spinning on the outside of a wheel as tracing that kind of cycloidal pattern. Because of course, once we add in more information, so we don't normally see rolling wheels just by seeing one single dot on the rim. So what happens when we add another light here shown at the center of our wheel? I'll show you again what they're doing and then turn off the lights. And suddenly, even though the outer dot is still tracing the exact same cycloid pattern that it was before, we simply cannot see the cycloid anymore. We just see the relative and the common motion. The relative motion is the outer dot spinning around the central dot, and the common motion is the entire configuration is moving left and right across the screen. Here's another single isolated dot. Now, what is this? Can you tell? It might not be very obvious what that was. But now let's add a couple more dots so that we can have, instead of an absolute motion vector, some relative and common motion vectors. And it might become obvious that we are watching a human leg walking across the screen. Now, what's this? Now that you're primed, you might recognize that as the hand of a person walking across the screen and swinging. But it is more obvious once we add in some dots for the elbow and the shoulder. And then we can tell that that's the swinging arm of a person walking across the screen. And of course, if we light up the leg and the arm, it becomes even more obvious what it is that we are seeing, a person walking. So again, we don't really pay attention to the individual path trajectories of each dot. Rather, the visual system is automatically grouping the entire configuration to create both relative and common motion perceptual vectors. And we see swinging arms and legs of a person walking. And from there, Johansson demonstrates just how many different kinds of actions, climbing some stairs, pulling on a rope or something, I don't know, ringing a bell, riding a bicycle, right? So it becomes almost trivially easy to recognize a variety of human actions in watching these point light displays. And so this is what Johansson is suggesting, is that, hey, just like I've said in the first video, there's a lot of information about objects here. We see that that's a person, right? But when I freeze frame it, just for the sake of doing it, if I were to show you, and if I were to show a naive research subject this still frame from the video and ask what it is you're seeing, it is unlikely that the person would identify this as two people, right? So from an object recognition perspective, there's no information here about what it is that we are seeing. But as soon as we allow things to move, we have a lot of information, and that's really the point. How much information is carried by the motion? There is a lot, apparently, of information in the motion, and it's information about two things. Again, objects and changes at the same time. We are perceiving not just a person, or in this case, two people, but we're also perceiving the kinds of changes that are taking place. That is the kind of an event. What is the person doing? He's walking, climbing stairs, riding a bicycle, and so forth. Now we have two people. We can see them distinctly as two separate people. We don't think they're together, linked somehow. It's two separate people doing their own thing. Here we see them shake hands and embrace. In fact, we might pause to think about, here they're just going to start reducing the information to show that once we reduce the information, it potentially becomes a little bit harder. Not too bad in this case. But ultimately, Johansson's point is that when we have more dots, we get more relative and common motion vectors, and it becomes much easier to recognize what it is we're seeing, both in terms of the object and the event. Back it up for a second here to this point. I went too far there. So these two people, is it possible for you to judge the sex of the actors here? Is one man and one woman? Are they both men, both women? Do they know each other? It seems as if there might be potentially a lot more information than we might guess at first pass. Not simply just the fact that we recognize two humans walking, shaking hands, and embracing, but we might even be able to tell man from woman, the nature of the relationship connection, emotional connection between them. That's possibly remains to be seen here. What else do we have in this video down here? We have some other examples of the point light walkers. Here we see a video of a point light walker walking now towards the camera rather than side to side, and we can see quite a bit about that person here. I don't think there's much that's interesting about this is some of that 3D structure for motion shape perception. And you can kind of tell that we're seeing a non-rigid transformation here. So in these situations, as I have said before, with perceptual constancy, when a square or rectangular object transforms, there are certain transformations that are quote unquote legal, and that would correspond to a rigid rotation of that object. But some transformations are not really legal, and that's not therefore something that could be interpreted as a rigid object. This would have to be a non-rigid deformation of the shape, right? And so the ability to tell the difference between a rigid versus non-rigid shape transformation it depends on following certain kinds of geometric rules that I don't think we're really going to need to get into too much. Now, on this slide, I just have some attempts here at depicting perceptual vector analysis, right, by taking vector components of our dots. So what I have here is a depiction of two dots, right? These two black dots here. One of them is moving up and down. The other one would be moving left and right. So try to imagine that in the kind of display that we saw before. But one's moving up and down, the other one's moving left and right. So that would be their absolute motion trajectory, right? But if these two dots were moving in a way that they were perfectly synchronized, so that as the one moved down and the other moved to the side, if you look at my fingers here, my fingertips would now represent the dots. They arrive together and then they move apart and then back together and then apart and then back together and then apart and back together, right? So we're seeing something like this, right? According to Johansson, what would happen is that we would not see this as two separate dots doing their own thing, one going up and down, one going left and right, but rather by taking vector components, we would perceive the two dots as, I'm going to try to use my fist here as a thing, as two different things attached by some invisible rubber band that are moving together like this. And this entire configuration is moving up and down on the screen, right, as they stretch apart and come together and stretch apart and come together, like they're attached by some invisible rubber band, right? And that's because of the kind of the perceptual vector analysis that's occurring here that discovers the relative motion, which is that back and forth rubber band between them. And the common motion is the entire configuration of those two things moving diagonally, right? So inside of this ellipse where I connected them as a whole, these back and forth arrows depict the relative motion, and this arrow here depicts the common motion of that entire configuration moving on another diagonal. Down here we have the cycloid of the outer dot of the rim of the wheel, and of course the center dot of the rim of the wheel would just go in a straight line to one side. And so again, through perceptual vector analysis, this is where we get the fact that when we actually observe the wheel, we see the spinning wheel as opposed to two different motions of two different dots, right? A few other things to say about Johansson's point light Walker research. So as noted, people are actually quite good at recognizing it as a person and recognizing the activities that the person is engaging in. But notice also here that I said, could you determine whether or not one is a man or one is a woman? And the answer was yes. Well, what Johansson found is that people could judge that correctly about 70 to 80% of the time. And then another variation that he did, and we don't have a video for this, but one thing that we could do is we could create essentially a patch light puppet, right? A point light puppet, a marionette puppet, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to, sometimes we call it patch light instead of point light, because what sometimes people do is they put reflective tape, like highly reflective tape on the joints of a person and then put them in a dark room, but then shine a spotlight on them. And that tape reflects the light and creates these shiny patches to move around, right? Doesn't matter whether we call it patch light or point light. So he created these marionette puppets, right? And imitated the whole point light thing with marionette puppets performing the same actions. And then he created these brief little video clips that were less than a half a second long of a marionette walker versus a human walker. And he would present the subjects with these videos and asking them to see if they could recognize the difference. Can you tell the difference between when it's a live human versus when it's a puppet? And the answer was always yes. Even when it was a super brief video clip that was less than half a second long, they could still easily do it, suggesting that beyond simply just the fact that the dots are moving in the same way at the same time, because certainly the marionette puppet is configured with the same arms and legs, so you have the same relative and common motions. There's a little something else happening when you have a living human being. You have something that we call biological motion going on here, right? And that biological motion has a certain kind of animacy that comes from the way in which our limbs accelerate. And Ed Johansson didn't really deeply explore the nature of animacy and the accelerations of biological motions, but he demonstrated from the very early time here that it was something that perceptually we're quite sensitive to, right? And this perceptual sensitivity to biological motion is something that later expanded to be a big deal. Here's another just depiction of the relative and common motion vectors for the rolling wheel. Here's just some depictions of our point light walkers here. And so the take-home lesson from Johansson's work is shown here. It is possible that through these kinds of motion displays, we can perceive both events and objects, right? And we perceive the objects as having certain properties, like we see the human body, and we know that that body is more elastic. Limbs, arms and legs can bend in non-rigid ways. We perceive the animacy, the liveliness, the biological motion. And how is it that we perceive both the object and the event? It's carried by the motion itself, right? When we freeze frame these videos, you're just going to see a bunch of dots. So the configuration of the dots, the spatial patterns, that's the important thing here. The spatial pattern is not sufficient to provide information about the object, and certainly not about the event. And it's not even enough to make comparisons between two successive spatial patterns. If you think back to the image comparison hypothesis, right? You have to be able to detect the motion directly, right? And by perceiving the motion, this is how you're going to be able to perceive the event and the object undergoing the event, right? So we have this question, apparently motions can inform about their causes. The cause being the underlying event, right? The fact that a living human generates motions differently than a marionette puppet suggests that there's a different cause behind the motion, right? And that different cause is perceivable, perhaps. And so this takes us into our next topic, which is whether or not we can perceive causality or cause and effect from events and from motion. And the related principle that I've abbreviated KSD is called kinematic specification of dynamics, but we're going to stop it here. This is another good point to stop before we move into the next major section.